often you've wondered why tears come into your eyes when burdens seem to be more than you can stand. But God is standing near. He sees your fallen tears. Tears are her language. God understands. When grief has left you low, it causes tears to flow. When things have not turned out the way that you had planned, but God won't forget you. His promises are all true. Tears are a language God understands. God sees the tears of a broken-hearted soul. He sees your tears and He hears them when they fall. God weeps along with man, takes him by the hand. Tears are her language. God understands. God weeps along with man and takes him by the hand. Tears are her language. God understands. Tears are her language. God understands.
I got into this grief thing strictly by, I can't say by accident because it wasn't by accident. I got into the grief thing because of 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Not knowing much about pancreatic cancer, we left the hospital, went home, got on the computer, and was hit with a stark realization that once pancreatic cancer is diagnosed, your death sentence is also diagnosed. There's only 2% of the people who have been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer is still alive in 5 years. Nobody has ever bypassed 5 years. So these last 3 years I was thrown into this thing. Because of that, my home church now, we have a support group that myself and another lady facilitates. I had been involved with a support group for maybe 2 years, and the lady that was facilitating that is the one that began to push me to do that. She says, "You're involved with people all the time anyway. You're good with people. You're not afraid to stand in front of people. So why don't you begin to think about this?" So I began my studying under a guy by the name of Dr. Alan Walfeld in the Colorado Springs area. I've gone to 2 or 3 of his seminars. One of the things we want to do this morning is disseminate some of the myths about grief. Number one, when we talk about grief or bereavement, bereavement itself means to be torn apart, to be ripped out, to be separated, to be cut off, to be cut away from. Any definition that you have along those lines is what bereavement is. It's brokenheartedness, it's broken spirit, it's broken body, it's broken mind. And anything that we come up with this point of grief is what it is. And one of the things we want to do this morning is try to tear down some of the common beliefs of grief. I had a woman ask me one time, what is the greatest grief? Well, my first thought about the greatest grief, I thought, well, gee, I don't know. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'll find out and get back with you. Well, I found out and got back with her. And do any of you have any idea what the greatest grief might be? Just off the cuff.
Being in hell, which you wasn't there.
Being in hell when she wasn't there. The greatest grief is the one you as an individual is going through. You know, your grief is different than my grief. My grief is different than your grief. We can go around the room and each and every one of us has a different area and a different plan and a different path of grief than anybody else. Simply because of our personality differences, the way we're put together. In our support group at home in the church, I refer back to David. When David says, I'm fearfully and wondrously made. He says, I'm intricately, I'm very diametrically set together. I'm very exquisitely put together. In another verse he says, in my mother's womb I was knit together. And that verse I've always loved, but it always, I never really did understand it. So I was talking to a guy one time and he says, you have to understand David was a warrior. And on the battlefield with the rough, hard instruments of war, he's seen soldiers ripped apart, cut apart, and he began to understand how the muscles and the tendons in our body are knit and put together, how intricately the tendons are molded into the bones. And so David understood that we really are an intricate individual put together by the hand of God. So the grief that you're going through is the grief that is the grief that is your personal grief. Some of the myths that we want to talk about this morning is grief and mourning are the same thing. For years I heard grief, and for years I heard about mourning. I thought, well, they're the same thing. Almost, but not quite. This is the way the New College Dictionary defines the difference between grief and mourning. Grief is that feeling in your gut where you feel like a mule has kicked you. Your stomach is in knots. Your brain can't function right. You're sick to your stomach. You're nauseous. You can't sleep. You can't eat. What you do eat many times comes back out. Your whole body is thrown into such a turmoil that you don't know what's going on. I went through a process where I thought I was going crazy. I finally ended up going to a counselor, and she says, you're not going crazy. You're grieving. Grieving is that point of an inner process that you go through. You go through it mentally. You go through it spiritually. You go through it physically. And it's a process, and the thing that I tell the people at home, once that individual in your life that has died, that you loved so greatly, it puts you on a journey, and you're going to be on that journey for the rest of your life. There are no set stages in your journey of grief. The stages I'm going through and the stages I've had to go through thus far is different than the stages that you're going through and are going to have to go through. You know, we look at each other. Each one of us has our own individual path of grief that we're going to have to follow the rest of our lives. Whether we like it, whether we don't, is totally immaterial. You're on a journey, and that journey you're going to be on the rest of your life. Some people are going to be able to manage it easier than other people. Here again, it depends on our individual personalities and how it's put together. Now, I appreciated Pastor Phil last night going through with a lot of scripture. I'm not going to go into a lot of scripture this morning. This is one of those things where it's just down-to-earth stuff that I think we need to know. We need to understand a little bit. Because as ministers and ministry, and even in our families, we need to understand some of these things so we know how to deal with individuals when we come in contact with them. Like I said, there are no set stages. There's no set stage of stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. Every individual has their own time limit that they're going to have to work with. One individual may get through one particular part far easier than anybody else. But it's our individual path that we're going to follow. There is no orderly, stage-like system to get through grief. Understand that. Don't let anybody try to tell you or put you into a box and say, well, you should be over this by now. You're never going to get over it. The intensity of all this will lessen over as time goes on. But this time of grief and this journey of grief that you're on, you're going to be on until either Jesus comes or He takes you home through your own death. And this is one of the things we really have to understand. This is a journey. When I left Fort Wayne and started down here, I started on a journey until I got here. Well, my journey is going to start again tomorrow afternoon or maybe Monday morning when I head back. This is a journey we're on. How many have heard the old saying, the best way to get through this is to just move on and get over it? How many of you heard that? It's time to get over it. It's time to move on. Get on with life. Well, unless we go through the steps and the walk of grief, we are never going to get over this. We have, in this process of grief, we have an area called recessed grief or regressed grief. It's a process where you haven't done your grief work, as I call it, from the beginning for the rest of your life. We have a lady in our group at home whose husband died 5 years ago. She came into the group and we were sitting there talking one evening with her. And one of the things I do, we always keep a box of Kleenex on the table. And while they begin to talk, we begin to just kind of ask them, you know, who you lost, how long ago, what was the circumstances, was it medical, was it an accident, you know. We come across all sorts of things, accident, a medical thing, suicide. We're dealing now with a lady that her son committed suicide. She's trying to work her way through that. But we keep these Kleenex on the table. And one of the things, so many times, that we do when somebody starts through this grief process and they begin to cry, the first thing we want to do is hand them a Kleenex, and basically what we're telling them is, well, it's okay. You don't need to cry right now. The best thing you can let the individual do is let them cry. When they start it in our meeting, we say, these Kleenex are for you to use. If you need the whole box, use the whole box. The process that we have to understand, the quicker the individual begins to release this pressure and all this hurt and all the pain inside, the easier it's going to be for them in their grief walk. It's one of those things that far too many we've had people say, well, you don't have to cry so much. Well, yeah, you do have to cry so much.